When Sarah Walker stepped into the elite tactical training camp, no one looked up. Small, quiet, without an iPad and wearing a faded hoodie, she was immediately sent to the office for identity verification. One instructor scoffed Ghost Viper. She looks like she's dodging basic service. But when her old backpack was unzipped and the steel tag in her hand glowed crimson, the entire camp fell silent. 60 seconds later, an MMA recruit lay unconscious after a single takedown in 9 seconds, and they began to understand she wasn't a candidate. She was a myth returned from the dark. Sarah stood there, her soft brown hair loose around her shoulders, her deep, calm eyes scanning the room. The camp was a fortress of egos, polished boots, high-tech gear, recruits flexing their credentials. She didn't belong. Not with her yellowed sneakers, her plain joggers, that worn military backpack slung over one shoulder. People glanced her way, then looked again harder, like they were trying to figure out what kind of mistake had led her through the gate. She didn't flinch. Didn't adjust her posture. Just walked toward the main briefing hall, her steps steady like she'd done this 100 times before. The whisper started before she even reached the door. Who let her in? Is she lost? Nobody said it to her face yet. But the air was thick with judgment, and Sarah felt it like a weight she'd carried her whole life. Before we go on, if this story's hitting you, maybe you felt that same kind of judgment, that same cold stare. Do me a favor. Grab your phone, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. It's just a small way to say you're with us, that you're a part of this journey. Your support keeps these stories alive. All right, let's keep going. The briefing hall was packed, rows of recruits in crisp uniforms, tablets glowing, instructors pacing like they owned the place. Sarah slipped in, found a seat near the back. Before she could even set her badge down, a guy in the row ahead spun around. He was big, linebacker build, his jacket screaming money. "You must be in the wrong room," he barked, loud enough for heads to turn. "This area's for official candidates only." A blonde girl 2 seats over her uniform, so new it practically sparkled, leaned in with a smirk. "Looking for the kitchen sweetheart." A teaching assistant, clipboard in hand, caught the exchange and frowned. "This class is for those who exceeded entry standards," he said, his tone clipped like Sarah was wasting his time. She didn't argue. Just reached into her backpack, pulled out a folded letter, her invitation, and handed it over. The guy snatched it, scanned it like he was looking for a typo. The blonde leaned over, squinting at the signature. "No way that's real," she muttered, "Dodd." The TA didn't even look at Sarah. "Take this to logistics," he said, handing the letter back. "Verify your credentials." Sarah nodded, tucked the letter away, and walked out. The room buzzed behind her, snickers, murmurs, someone saying, "She'll be gone by noon." Logistics was a cramped office down the hall, papers stacked high, a senior officer behind a desk. He took one look at her and sighed. Name?" Sarah gave it. He typed it into his system, then froze. His eyes flicked up, then back to the screen. "You're a direct admit from the G Special program." His voice had an edge like he didn't believe it. Another instructor leaning against the wall perked up. "G Special? Wasn't that decommissioned?" The officer ignored him, printed out a clearance form, and shoved it towards Sarah. "You're verified. But don't expect special treatment." She took the form, her face blank, and headed back to the hall. When she returned, the seating had shifted. No one saved her spot. They'd placed her with the moral rehab squad, a group of misfits in the corner, guys with disciplinary records, girls who'd failed psych evals. A recruit nearby leaned over and whispered, "She'll be gone by Friday." Sarah sat down, pulled out her notebook, and started writing. No iPad, just a pen scratching quietly. As the first day's drills began, Sarah stood at the edge of the training field, watching recruits sprint through obstacle courses. A wiry female instructor, her hair pulled tight in a bun, strode over her boots, kicking up dust. "You're not participating." She snapped, her eyes raking over Sarah's faded hoodie. "Or are you just here to take notes like some wannabe journalist?" A few recruits nearby snickered, slowing their runs to eavesdrop. Sarah met the instructor's gaze, her expression calm. "I'm observing," she said, her voice steady. The instructor scoffed loud enough for the whole field to hear. "Observing? This isn't a spectator sport, kid. Either get in line or get out." Sarah didn't move. She flipped a page in her notebook, her pen hovering. The instructor's face reddened. "Fine. Stand there like a statue. But you're wasting space." She stormed off, barking orders at the others. A recruit jogging by muttered, "What a loser," just loud enough for Sarah to hear. She kept writing, her hands steady, but her jaw tightened for a split second. A flicker of something no one caught. The lecture started, some high-ranking officer droning about tactical formations. Sarah listened, her pen moving steadily. Halfway through, the instructor stopped mid-sentence. His eyes locked on her. "Candidate," he said, his voice sharp, "you didn't bring a tablet. That's a violation. Possibly hiding contraband." The room went quiet. Every head turned. Sarah looked up, her expression calm. "I have what I need," she said, her voice low but clear. The instructor wasn't having it. "Unzip your bag." "Now." She didn't move. Two assistants marched over, grabbed her backpack, and dumped it onto a table at the front. A boy in the front row chuckled. "Bet she's smuggling homemade bread or something." The assistant stepped back. Everyone leaned in, waiting for the big reveal. Silence. Inside the bag, a few pens, her notebook, and a perfectly folded military uniform. The fabric was faded, but the creases were sharp, like it had been pressed with care. Stitched onto the chest was a small patch, SV013. A murmur rippled through the room. "Ghost Viper," someone whispered. "That's the Ghost Viper designation." An instructor, older, his face lined from years in the field, stepped closer. He stared at the uniform, then at Sarah. "I met someone once with SV015, he said almost to himself. No one survived her sparring rounds. Sarah didn't react. She walked to the table, gently refolded the uniform, and placed it back in her bag. Then she sat down, her movements slow, deliberate. The instructor cleared his throat, tried to restart the lecture. But the room wasn't the same. Eyes kept darting to Sarah, to her bag, to the empty space around her. During a break, Sarah sat alone on a bench outside her notebook, open, sketching something, a map maybe, or a formation. A group of recruits passed by, their laughter cutting through the air. One, a lanky guy with a custom smartwatch, stopped and pointed. "Yo, check out Homeless Viper," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. The others burst out laughing, one mimicking her slouched posture, another pretending to scribble in an imaginary notebook. "What's she writing?" "Her diary." The lanky guy went on, stepping closer. "Dear Journal, today I got kicked out of camp for being a nobody." Sarah's pen paused just for a moment. She looked up, her eyes locking onto his. "You done?" she asked, her voice so quiet it barely carried. The guy froze, his smirk faltering. The others went silent, waiting for his comeback. He opened his mouth, then closed it, and walked away, muttering something under his breath. Sarah went back to her sketch, but the page trembled slightly under her hand. By lunch, the whispers had turned into full-on arguments. A recruit, a wiry guy with a buzz cut, slammed his tray on the table. "No way she's a Ghost Viper," he said, loud enough for the whole cafeteria to hear. A group nearby nodded. "She probably looted it off a corpse," one said. "Look how old that uniform is." A girl with a sleek ponytail pulled out her phone, angled it towards Sarah. "Fake elite busted," she muttered, starting a live stream. "Caught, LARPing at JCTC." Sarah sat alone, eating a sandwich, her notebook open beside her. She didn't look up. But the air was heavy now, the kind of tension that comes before a storm. A mid-ranking officer approached her table, his face stern. "We're running a full identity scan," he said. "Hand over any identification." Sarah stayed silent. She reached into her hoodie, pulled out a steel tag on a chain, and set it on the table. The officer picked it up, turned it over. His fingers hesitated. In the mess hall, as Sarah took a bite of her sandwich, a tray clattered nearby. A recruit, a broad-shouldered woman with a buzzed mohawk, stood over her arms, crossed. "You think you're slick, huh?" she said, her voice loud enough to draw eyes. "Parading around with that tag like you're some war hero. My brother was in special ops. He'd never let some poser disrespect his unit." The room hushed, forks pausing midair. Sarah set her sandwich down, wiped her hands on her joggers, and looked up. "What's your brother's name?" she asked, her tone even. The woman blinked, caught off guard. "What?" Sarah repeated slower, "His name?" The woman stammered, Ronnie Tate." Sarah nodded, her eyes distant for a moment. "Good man? Kandahar, right? He carried his squad leader 2 miles under fire." The woman's arms dropped, her face paling. Sarah picked up her sandwich and took another bite. The room stayed quiet, the woman standing there frozen like she had just been stripped bare. The tag was dull, scratched, nothing special. But when Sarah touched it, it glowed red, a faint pulse of light revealing a restricted unit insignia. The officer's eyes widened. He pulled out his phone, snapped a photo, and sent it off. 60 seconds later, his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, and it slipped from his hand, clattering onto the table. The screen flashed, "Access denied, Omega clearance required." A senior advisor burst into the room, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "Everyone stand down," he barked. "She's not here to be evaluated." The room froze. Sarah picked up the tag, reattached it to her neck, and went back to her sandwich. The officer stood there, his mouth half open like he'd seen a ghost. In the afternoon, during a team strategy session, Sarah was paired with the moral rehab squad for a mock mission. The group groaned as she joined them, their eyes rolling. A stocky recruit with a neck tattoo leaned over, his voice low but vicious. "Don't screw this up, charity case," he said, shoving a map into her hands. "Just stay out of our way." The others nodded, already dismissing her. Sarah unfolded the map, her fingers tracing the grid lines. When the instructor called for plans, the group's leader, a loudmouth with a shaved head, presented a sloppy ambush strategy, ignoring Sarah entirely. The instructor frowned, about to critique, when Sarah spoke up, her voice cutting through the chatter. "Your flank's exposed," she said, pointing to the map. "They'll cut you off here and here." The room went quiet. The leader scoffed. "What, you're a general now?" Sarah didn't respond. She slid the map back and sat down. Later, when the simulation failed exactly as she'd predicted, the leader's face burned red, but he didn't look her way. Later that day, during a comms training session, Sarah sat at a radio console, her headphones loose around her neck. The instructor, a lanky man with a permanent scowl, hovered nearby, watching her every move. "Let's see if you can handle this," he said, his voice thick with skepticism. "Patch through to the secondary channel. Don't mess it up." A few recruits snickered, expecting her to fumble. Sarah adjusted the dials, her fingers moving with precision, and spoke into the mic. "Echo 3, this is Viper, confirm signal." The response came back crystal clear. The instructor's scowl deepened, but he said nothing. A recruit nearby, a guy with a flashy earpiece, leaned over. "Bet she just got lucky," he muttered. Sarah glanced at him, then tapped a button on the console, cutting his channel mid-sentence. His voice crackled out and the room stifled laughs. She reset the console and leaned back, her face blank, but the air around her felt sharper, like she'd just drawn a line. The rest of the day was a blur of drills, lectures, simulations. Sarah moved through it all, quiet, unnoticed, except by the ones who couldn't stop staring. The buzz-cut guy from lunch, the blonde from the briefing hall, the TA who'd sent her to logistics, they were building a case against her, their voices low but sharp. "She's a fraud," the guy said during a break. "That tag's probably fake, too." The blonde nodded, scrolling through her phone. "Wait till this hits the forums." "She's done." Sarah overheard, but didn't react. She was stretching near the training mats, her movements fluid like she was warming up for something no one else could see. The lead officer, a grizzled man with a scar across his jaw, walked over. "We're settling this," he said, his voice carrying across the field. "She claims Ghost Viper. Let's see it." A towering recruit stepped forward, a former Marine, his arms thick with muscle, his grin cocky. "I'll teach her a lesson," he said, cracking his knuckles. The officer nodded. "Get to the mat." The field gathered recruits forming a loose circle. The Marine kicked a punching pad, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "I don't hit women," he said, smirking at Sarah. "But you'll need a medic after I'm done." Sarah removed her hoodie, folded it neatly, and set it on the ground. She stepped onto the mat barefoot, her joggers loose, her hair tied back. Not a word. The crowd leaned in, phones out, some already recording. She stood perfectly still for 5 seconds. Hands loose, eyes unblinking. The Marine charged, his fist cocked back. Sarah dodged once, a subtle shift of her weight. His punch missed. She stepped in, locked his neck with one arm, and flipped him over her hip. He slammed onto the mat, nose bleeding, gasping. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled. 9 seconds. The crowd was silent. Sarah bowed once, a small formal gesture, and walked off the mat. A general-level advisor watching from the sidelines leaned toward an aide. "Viper 013, he whispered. "We thought she vanished in X Delta." After the fight, Sarah sat on the sidelines, her water bottle in hand, her eyes fixed on the horizon. A young recruit, barely 19, approached her hesitantly, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "That was insane," he said, his voice shaky with awe. "How'd you learn to do that?" Sarah looked at him, her expression softening for the first time. She tilted her head, considering him. "You really want to know?" she asked. He nodded eagerly. She leaned forward, her voice low. "Stop trying to prove you're enough. Just be..." The kid blinked, his mouth opening, then closing. He nodded slowly, like he'd been handed a secret he didn't fully understand. Sarah took a sip of water and looked away, her face unreadable again. The kid walked off, his shoulders a little straighter, but the weight of her words lingered in the air. The camp didn't recover. The Marine was carried off, his pride more bruised than his body. The blonde girl's live stream cut off mid-sentence, her face pale as she shoved her phone into her pocket. The buzz-cut guy stared at the ground, his tray of food untouched. Sarah went back to her notebook, her pen moving like nothing had happened. But the whispers were different now. Who is she? Why's she here? Someone noticed her backpack, how she never let it out of her sight. Another caught the way the senior advisor avoided her eyes during the next briefing. Little things. A glance that lingered too long. A name dropped in a hushed conversation. The pieces were coming together, and the camp was starting to feel it. During a late-night equipment check, Sarah was tasked with inspecting gear alongside the moral rehab squad. The group worked in silence, but the tension was palpable. A recruit with a chipped front tooth, known for his temper, tossed a rifle onto the table in front of her. "Check this, Viper," he sneered, the nickname dripping with sarcasm. "Or is that above your pay grade?" Sarah picked up the rifle, her fingers moving expertly over the mechanism, checking the chamber, the sights, the trigger. She set it down and looked at him. "It's jammed," she said, her voice flat. "You didn't clean it." The guy laughed, but it was forced. "Yeah, right. It's fine." The instructor overseeing the check stepped over, ran the same inspection, and frowned. "She's right. It's jammed. You're on report." The recruit's face fell, his hands clenching. Sarah turned to the next rifle, her focus unbroken, but the room felt smaller, the air tighter. That night in the barracks, Sarah sat on her bunk, her notebook open. The moral rehab squad kept their distance, but one of them, a skinny kid with a scar on his cheek, worked up the nerve to approach. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "Is it true? You're one of them?" Sarah looked up, her eyes steady. "One of who?" She asked, her tone neutral. The kid swallowed. You know, Ghost Viper. SV013. She didn't answer. Just closed her notebook and lay back on her bunk. The kid backed off, but he didn't stop staring. Neither did the others. The barracks were quiet, but the tension was alive, humming in the dark. The next morning during a live fire exercise, Sarah was assigned to observe from the control tower. As recruits fired at moving targets, a cocky sharpshooter, his cap tilted back, noticed her standing there. What's she doing up here? He called out, his voice carrying over the gunfire. She gonna grade our aim with her little notebook. The others laughed, their shots going wide. The range officer, a stern woman with a buzz cut, turned to Sarah. You got something to say? Sarah set her notebook down, stepped to the edge of the platform, and pointed to a target 300 yards out. Your third shooter's pulling left, she said, her voice clear. He's overcompensating for the wind. The officer checked the monitor, her eyes narrowing. She barked into her radio, and the shooter adjusted. His next shot hit dead center. The sharpshooter's grin faded. Sarah picked up her notebook and stepped back, her face blank, but the officer's gaze lingered on her, a flicker of respect breaking through. During a group debrief after the exercise, Sarah sat quietly as the sharpshooter from the range stood to present his team's performance. He gestured wildly, boasting about his hits, but his eyes kept darting to Sarah. Not like some people who just watch and take notes, he added, his voice sharp. The room tittered. Sarah didn't react, but she shifted her weight, her fingers brushing the edge of her notebook. The range officer, still seated, cut in. Walker, she said, her tone firm. Your assessment. Sarah stood, her movements unhurried. Your team's accuracy was 82%, she said, her voice steady. But your reloads were slow. Cost you 12 seconds. The sharpshooter's face reddened. What, you timed us? Sarah nodded once. I observe. The officer nodded, jotting something down. The sharpshooter sat, his bravado gone, the room buzzing with a new kind of tension, respect mixed with unease. The next morning, the lead officer called an assembly. Everyone stood at attention, but their eyes kept drifting to Sarah. She stood in the back, her hoodie on her backpack slung over one shoulder. The officer cleared his throat. We've received new information, he said, his voice tight. Candidate Walker is not under evaluation. She's here on observation status. Direct orders from command. A murmur ran through the crowd. The blonde girl from the briefing hall shifted uncomfortably, her phone tucked away. The buzz-cut guy clenched his fists, his face red. The officer went on outlining the day's drills, but his words felt hollow. The real message was clear. Sarah wasn't one of them. She was something else. By midday, the camp was fracturing. The TA who'd sent Sarah to logistics was called into a closed-door meeting. He came out pale, his clipboard shaking in his hands. Word spread he'd been reassigned, effective immediately. No explanation. The blonde girl's live stream from the day before had been flagged. Her account was suspended, her sponsorship with a tactical gear brand gone. The buzz-cut guy got into a shouting match with an instructor, something about unfair treatment. He was sent to disciplinary review, his chances of graduating slim. None of it was loud or dramatic. Just consequences rolling in like a tide. During a rare moment of downtime, Sarah stood by the camp's memorial wall, a stone slab etched with names of fallen operatives. She traced a finger over one name, her touch light, almost reverent. An older instructor, the one who'd mentioned SV015, walked by and stopped. You knew him? He asked, his voice softer than before. Sarah didn't look at him. Yeah, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He saved my life once. The instructor nodded, his eyes distant. Lost a lot of good ones in X-Delta, he said. Sarah's hand dropped and she turned away, her backpack brushing against the wall. The instructor watched her go, his face heavy with something unspoken, like he'd just glimpsed a piece of her past she'd never share. Sarah kept moving through the camp, her presence quiet but heavy. She sat in on lectures, watched drills, wrote in her notebook. People stopped mocking her. They stopped talking to her altogether. But they watched. Always watching. During a break, an instructor, one of the older ones, the one who'd mentioned SV015, approached her. "You're not here to train," he said, his voice low. "Why are you really here?" Sarah looked at him, her eyes calm but unyielding. "To see who's ready," she said. It was the first time she'd spoken more than a few words. The instructor nodded like he'd expected it and walked away. That afternoon, during a navigation drill in the woods, Sarah was assigned to monitor a team from the sidelines. The recruits, led by the loudmouth from the strategy session, bickered as they fumbled with their compasses. One, a wiry girl with a nose ring, spotted Sarah standing under a tree, her notebook in hand. "What, you too good to get your hands dirty?" she shouted, her voice carrying through the brush. The others laughed, egging her on. "Go back to your diary, Viper." Sarah didn't respond. She pointed to a ridge on their map, her voice calm. "You're off by 200 meters. Adjust east." The girl scoffed, but the team's navigator checked his compass and froze. "She's right," he muttered. The laughter died. The team adjusted course, their faces tight, Sarah's shadow looming larger than they'd ever admit. That afternoon, the camp got a visitor. A man stepped out of a black SUV, his suit plain but perfectly tailored. He was tall, his hair graying at the temples, his face unreadable. He didn't introduce himself. Didn't need to. The moment he walked into the briefing hall, the room changed. Instructors stood straighter. Recruits fell silent. The senior advisor, the one who'd burst in the day before, hurried to his side, whispering something.